It's you, me, and God. We are in God through Christ. We are in Christ, and through that, He is in our marriage. Hello, everybody, and welcome to podcast number 105 of the Gordon and Cherise Show. We are so excited to be back with you. And Gordon, what was supposed to be one podcast, we are just continuing the series right now because there is so much to say about marriage. Sorry, I didn't mean to say it that way. Marriage. Right? It's not The Princess Bride. This is real marriage. And we're talking about weathering the storms in marriage. We're continuing with this. And honey, we haven't experienced any storms, have we?
Oh, no. Of course not.
It's been like smooth sailing for almost the 27 years that we've been married.
We've had the perfect marriage.
Zero.
No conflicts, no difficulties, no challenges.
We really have nothing to contribute to this podcast because everything has just been perfect.
Right. And for everyone who's listening, the reason this is a 4-part marriage series is the fact that all of us have experienced difficulties, challenges, trials that are overwhelming to many couples in marriage.
Well, you were very gracious to me this morning as you didn't pound this point into me, but you definitely reminded me. You walked in as I'm getting ready and you were like, honey, can you do something for me in the future? And I was like, what is that? I'm very curious about it. And you're like, can you please just put the clothes in the dryer if you're going to start them in the washer? After all of these years, you know, and I'm like, well, there's nothing but towels in there. And you're like, no, honey, my shorts were in there. So you're like, thank you, honey, for that washer smell that is all over my shorts because they've been in that washer all night long.
So we are literally airing our dirty laundry. Is that what you're saying?
I would say clean with a mild smell of mildew.
Yeah.
That's the laundry we're airing today.
Well, again, I didn't anticipate this to turn into a 4-part series. In fact, this thing could go for 6, 7, 8 parts, but we're going to try to cut it off at 4. Mm-hmm. There's so many relevant points, not just to make about marriage and how to keep a good marriage together, but when you're struggling with chronic pain, there's a lot of tidbits, a lot of insight to share with other people to help encourage them to move on in their marriage and not give up.
That's so right.
So let's start here. Let's get started. Last time on the last podcast, we did talk about communication and the importance of communication. And I wanted to re-stress a point before we begin today's program.
Please.
And it's this. Why share the same old things with our spouse? When we feel like we're stuck in a rut, why do we keep sharing all these toxic things? Or if someone's dealing with chronic pain and they wake up every morning and say, I've got pain located here, 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 here. Can you help me do something with it? Mm-hmm. And you go through it over and over and over again. It becomes very monotonous. I would say 2 things. Yes, you want to break that loop.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Okay? Even though you have pain. Okay? But number 2, I want you to see a good point to this, and I know this has happened to us. Healing is very sanctifying. In other words, it's going to happen over time. So when we stay in good communication with our spouses, that's when true healing takes place. And I've seen it take place through the sharing of our weaknesses. It's in those weak places that healing happens. I've seen it in our communication.
It's such an interesting dynamic because sharing in the weaknesses doesn't mean that we have to be consumed by them.
Correct.
And sharing them doesn't mean, for me, which I'm such an empath, the times where you share them and then I take them on to be my own, that's where that communication shuts down. But when they're shared so that they can be lifted up to God, so that that burden can be shared, it's not quite as heavy at that point if it's not taken inside. And so I find that you and I, well, besides the animal noises you make that nobody knows about,
Oh boy. Okay.
I think we have a new form of communication that has developed over these years. You know, I don't even sometimes have to ask you how you're doing. I can just look at you, and I don't have to drive the point home. Sometimes that communication there's a nonverbal part that's there. Sometimes it's in the unsaid that there's lots of power.
Well, a lot of times what happens, let's take someone with chronic pain. Let's take where we first started with communication. There was a lot of times I tried to hide my painful brokenness from you.
Yeah. And then
so,
I would try to beat it out of you. Like that added to your pain.
Well, I think later on in the years, but I think at first you had no idea what to do.
Well,
okay?
That's true.
And so when I was dealing with that painful brokenness, and I said, okay, I want to separate that from Cherise, and I'm only going to say good things to Cherise and only be optimistic. What happened is that there was a chasm developed within me
because you weren't real.
I couldn't express my true self with my pain. There was too much shame, and I didn't want to put a load on you. And I think a lot of people want to do that. So when you start sharing in those weaknesses and you start confessing and you start realizing that there is a profound codependency that we have with others and our closest ones. Now, here's the deal.
But not an unhealthy codependency.
But not an unhealthy one.
Yeah.
It's important to be in position in your relationship, and it's important to be in a purpose with your relationship where you can put your eyes on higher things but still be real. So when you're sharing in those weaknesses with your spouse or a family member, a friend, or a partner, what happens is all of that false self starts to wash away. It starts to get stripped away. So when you're in your weakness and you're communicating truthfully and you're looking for the truth and you're looking for connection and you're looking for love and you're realizing you can share vulnerably and fully and truly with another individual, we've seen a lot of healing with that in our relationships because it's perpetuated marital growth.
I think so. But that other person, Gordon, has to be healthy enough that you can share that with, because you can't just share it with everybody.
Correct.
You know, there's a sacred space to share that vulnerability and weakness.
I couldn't agree more, because when you start sharing it with everyone, expecting or anticipating a response that's favorable to you, really what happens is you walk into a measure of comparison.
Or you feel more lonely because most people are not equipped to deal with the intensity.
You'll face more rejection. It turns into a sales transaction.
So, but we're really, I mean, this talk is really more limited to marriage, and if there is no sharing of that vulnerability, there is nothing real. But that other spouse who is taking that information in, I would just say this as my own learning experience through this, Gordon. When you've shared it with me, I don't need to then take on the burden of trying to fix it.
That would be lovely.
And so I do catch myself maybe 30 times a day, right? But when you share it, sometimes you just need to share it. And you don't need to be judged in it. You don't need to be fixed in that moment. You need to share it so that you can allow space for more healing to be inside of you.
Right.
Which comes from God and not me.
Correct.
And so, but sharing it also, it takes away this wall, this division that pain does bring up. And that vulnerability. Now, I have to be safe in a safe enough place inside of me to accept it. And I've learned that sharing it doesn't make you weaker, Gordon. It actually makes you stronger.
Right.
And I've seen that in you. I've seen that sharing it it's like you're not taking something away from your healing process and the strength that God has given you.
Right. And what happens in the communication is this. We first shared about pain. Let's just take one subject. Okay? And as the years go on, as a couple in a marriage, you develop the art of communication. And the art of communication is not staying stuck on one topic. It's moving on to several different topics. And then you do understand, here's my position. Here's my place. Here's my purpose. Here's where I feel good and more complete with the spouse that I'm communicating with. And then the subject matter, even though, let's say in our marriage, chronic pain still exists, it doesn't have to take up 99% of our thoughts or our communication.
I would say our grandkids do.
Well, our grandkids do. But there's a growth. There's an art of communication.
Totally. That's so true, Gordon. It opens up the doors because who wants to be in a dull marriage? Who wants to just talk about pain?
Well, and yes. And then when we don't have communication, it's like we're going to go right off the slide into the next topic, which leads to lack of sexual intimacy.
Yep.
That happens in marriage. If you can't communicate verbally and you can't communicate non-verbally with a touch or a hug or a kiss or, hey, listen, move over here. I'll lift the dishes out of the dishwasher. I'll take care of this. I'll serve you in this way. I'll cook for you in this way. I'll do something extra for you because I'm going to treat you and regard you more highly than I do myself. When we start losing that attitude, okay, that translates into the most important times of being physically intimate with our spouse.
So I will put your clothes in the dryer when we get home, I promise.
That would be lovely, Cherise.
But, it's so true. You've said this from the beginning of our marriage, that the intimacy of our relationship, it begins in the kitchen. That's why I've learned to become a very good cook. But you do say, and I think that is true. It's the very smallest acts of love and kindness that can lead into larger parts of the intimacy in our marriage. And so if that's ignored and then you just go for the intimacy part, it's not there because it wasn't developed.
Well, usually sexual intimacy equates to sexual relations. Okay? And in serving the smaller parts of your life and showing someone you can serve them and love them and regard them higher than yourself, and you can be generous with them with your thoughts and your time and your resources.
Yeah.
What happens? That expression of love you have for someone else, okay, as you move it to a private place, okay, let's say a bedroom, for instance. When you move it to that area, it's not that, hey, I'm going to have good sex with my partner. It's more or less, am I going to have an act or an expression of closeness that's developed one step further than just having the verbal and nonverbal cues?
Well, you talked about it earlier with vulnerability, sharing your weakness and your vulnerability. There's nothing more vulnerable than spouses being connected in that intimacy in the bedroom and literally taking every layer of life off. Those layers start in the very basics of communication.
Absolutely.
And I agree with you. It's so important. So
when the marriage declines and we're dealing with different people that we know that are giving up on their marriage and they don't have sex anymore, they don't share in that way, or
they're having an affair.
Or there's sexual problems with their partner because it triggers a cycle that it seems very difficult to even have sex with your partner because you're not emotionally invested anymore. Okay, you're not in those particular places. we've seen that a lot. So the question is just how do you repair that sexual intimacy?
And we are not licensed counselors to determine all of this, but we do have thoughts based on
have
our
some
own
excellent
life.
insights.
Yes.
Okay, especially with this topic.
Yeah.
Chronic pain is a real barrier to having sexual intimacy for a lot of
100%.
people.
Gordon, there were times where we couldn't touch each other for months at a time.
Well, when we first got married, we'll share very vulnerably. I had the RSD, or complex regional pain syndrome. Okay. Now, folks, for everyone listening out there, my body was so hyperactive and hypersensitive to any stimulus. I don't care if it was a hug or a touch. I could not even distinguish between hot or cold water. And my body the nervous system was so on fire. It felt like someone put a match to my skin.
Yep. You were just in bed and you couldn't handle sometimes even the sheets.
The sheets were too heavy. And so we went through that time. But here's what we did through that time. We also had intimacy with the Heavenly Father. We had intimacy in our prayer life. We shared vulnerably with our communication about pain. We still looked at each other with honor. And as time grew and as our neural networks changed, and fortunately the RSD calmed down and went into remission, we were actually more equipped for adaptation to share physically and to share better and to have more excitement and to go to the next level that we didn't anticipate.
I was going to say, we didn't even know, though, that your health would come back to any ability to be sexually functional or to...
Correct.
There was a time where, and I was very, very young, at that point. I'm not saying you weren't, but I was younger than you are. I still am. But, the interesting thing about it, you're right. I mean, it developed a deeper sense. The deepest intimacy is not always in the bedroom. It's, I find that, yes, that's very important. It's very powerful, but the deepest intimacy is all of the years that I carry with you, all of the conversations, all the depth, the prayers, as you said, all of that.
There's also romance, Cherise.
Well, there is.
Okay, but go ahead, Cherise. I'm listening.
But in those times where it can't be expressed in that way, it can be very lonely. It can be very lonely for the spouse who is okay.
Right.
You're dealing with the acute part, so it's not quite on your mind like it would be the person who isn't hurting. But I'll tell you, it was another form of waiting in my marriage. I waited in my life for you. And then it was like, wow, this is a waiting time, because this pain is definitely in between being in that intimacy with you as a young bride.
It was a true roadblock. It affected capability.
Yeah, there's many people who have gone through this.
And still are going through
and
this.
And it's not a little thing to talk. This is not a small thing to talk about.
Right.
I'm very sorry for the pain that any of you are experiencing on either side of this.
Right.
But I would just encourage you that it doesn't have to be over because of that.
Correct. And that would add me to the next point. And the next point is what would you do, okay, to go through the pain, the emotional pain, the physical pain, the true roadblocks? What would you do to get to the other side where you can have that sense of physical closeness again? I would say this, you just mentioned it. Number one, don't give up on it. Okay, so if you don't give up on something, it means this. Don't carry shame and embarrassment about having lack of sexual intimacy when you're going through a particular season.
Yep, that's right.
Okay.
And spouse that is healthy, don't shame the one who is sick.
Absolutely.
Because they're already feeling bad enough.
Absolutely.
You have to give them some space.
Number two, deal with the emotions first. And a lot of times those emotions, even though it's the language of the body, those emotions, you probably need to just set everything aside and put it on pause and redistribute your thoughts with God. Have a different prayer life. Have different contemplative prayer. These are real issues. You can't necessarily be guided by your emotions of neglect or rejection. Okay?
Right.
That will take you the wrong place. And then number 3, what's going to happen is when you go through a period of time, I notice this between us, yes, there's a time of adaptation. For instance, and we're being very vulnerable here on this podcast, okay? Is this podcast rated PG right now, or is it R or PG-13? Okay.
Leave the room.
Leave the room, children. It's this. Let's say, for instance, with low back pain, and you can't move, but you still want to share. Remain on your back. Don't get into positions. Adaptation is important. Don't get into positions that are necessarily going to hurt you. Neck.
I had no idea we were going there right now.
Well, it just popped up.
Oh my
gosh. But what happens is that adaptation leads to sexual curiosity with your partner. And it's a great time to say, let's hold hands through this. And we're connected, two as one in the flesh. I mean, we share the same spirit. Let's go through this together and have fun.
Well, it's not always fun, Gordon.
Well,
but, I mean,
have some joy, have some excitement, have some curiosity, and move forward on that.
That's good.
Okay. The next topic we're going to talk about, we're off this one. Okay.
Wow.
Do you feel like we covered enough of that?
I mean, we only covered. Never mind.
Yes.
I don't even know how to follow up with this. I do, but I should just stay in my lane.
Okay, let's move into the fact in your marriage, if it's deteriorating, it's easy to move into disbelief. So you have a covenant relationship, and it appears justified with what we can see. How many times have we seen different couples through the years where it's like, boy, that's the perfect marriage. They never have any marital problems. Their relationship looks perfect. They look like the Brady Bunch of marriages. The kids are happy. There's blended families. Everyone is loving it. The adults love each other. And you find out 20 years later, they're divorced.
On Facebook, there's another spouse.
It's unreal.
Yeah.
Okay, disbelief means this. When you have your beliefs in your marriage and they start to melt away, and they actually start at the core of love, which is a spiritual connection. When those start to move into disbelief, we essentially move into dismissing something or dismissing our spouse completely. I would say this, not just pause and look inwardly, but also evaluate your values.
Yes.
Regarding your beliefs. A lot of times, that book by Emerson Eggerichs, the best-selling author of Love and Respect, he says that women need love and men need respect, and it's as simple and as complicated as that. I don't know if I agree totally with that premise, but I think the point is this. What does your spouse need? How does that cup need to be filled with love? What are the values about that individual's beliefs? You do not want to walk in disbelief with your marriage. It is a dangerous enemy.
And I can say this, Gordon, that even when you're in pain, you can still be generous to your spouse.
Very much so.
And you have been. Like finding out as being curious about what I value over the years of our marriage. Being curious to, the word is adapt, to change. Because if you only based our marriage on what you value, I would have run out of the door a long time ago. Because I don't value the same things you value in some ways. I'm not talking about God and all of that, but I'm just talking about different parts of living in life. But you have adapted to my values. I've adapted to yours. And pain does not have to be a barrier for that. It's actually really amazing how when you learn to live for somebody else and their joy in their value system, if it transforms everything about the marriage. It really, really does. And for me, I've developed a whole different side of appreciation on things that I would have never had in my life to begin with.
Right. And part of the values, as you're mentioning, is being able to examine what is that thing that stands between your partner and you. What is the elephant in the room?
Don't be afraid to look at it.
Right.
Because it can be a grasshopper and not a monster if you turn around and face it.
Mm-hmm. It can also be an alignment problem.
Okay, chiropractor.
Yes.
Explain this.
So if you're sensing that your marriage is fractured, it may be divided because of all of these triggers of, having your eyes of infidelity and wanting something else, and your spouse isn't as important, and you're having financial problems, and my goodness, chronic pain. 75 to 80% of people are getting divorced. You just want to set it aside. I would say this: whatever is in the middle of the union that you have with your spouse, and I just mentioned the bad things. The good things could be this. Your spouse could be working too much. They could be very successful. They could have other ambitions that they start growing as individuals away from their marriage.
Right.
Okay. I think it's important to do this, is to settle down in your marriage and come to an agreement in this union and say, hey, listen, we need to align ourselves with God. We need to align ourselves with a higher purpose.
Absolutely.
And that stimulates the growth of love in your marriage.
So good, Gordon.
Okay. We have seen that through 26 years. We're in our 27th year of marriage, and we can see the seasons. We could not exactly see it at the beginning, at the worst times of, this raging pain that we were dealing with.
No, not at all. But you just said the most important part: aligning with God, not aligning separate from God and trying to make it work. There's no power in that. Ecclesiastes talks about a cord of 3 strands is not easily broken. So it's not you and me. The mystery is it's not you and me in this marriage. It's you, me, and God. We are in God through Christ. We're in Christ. And through that, He is in our marriage. He is with us. Our marriage is in Christ. There is a mystery and a beauty to that.
Yes, there is. And folks, we are encouraging you, especially if you share the faith in Jesus Christ, okay? Don't give up on your marriage.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, I don't care how dead it appears. And we're going to talk about that in the next podcast. I don't care how dead it seems in your marriage. Don't give up. Okay? Can you make it for the rest of today?
Yeah.
Yes.
And
yes, you can.
Sometimes it's that you have to even ask yourself that question.
Well, sometimes you and I have that same mindset. Okay, even though we have a great marriage, sometimes there's a lot of things that we deal with life that's stress-packed.
It's amazing.
We have to just take it a step at a time and say, can we make it through today? And then when you do that and pause, you can focus on God again. Reset your body. Reset your motion.
Totally.
Okay. We're coming to the end of this particular podcast, and I'm loving this. Okay. What is your thought for the day or valuable takeaway that you have for someone who's listening?
I think in this segment, what I'm reminded of is to get to this place where intimacy can reign in your marriage. Take away the barriers, take away the judgment, take away, practice quick forgiveness. Quick forgiveness that maybe you're in a marriage that you didn't think you would be in because pain might be in the middle of it. And it may be triggering your own pain. But take a break from this thought process for a little bit because there is healing. There is another side to the story. And the beauty of marriage, it's living, it's dynamic. It's something that transcends pain. It really, really does.
Yeah.
So hold on, hold fast, hold on to God when you can't hold on to your spouse, and trust him with the darkest and the deepest and the most lonely places that you have that marriage is not fulfilling right now. Trust God. I'm not saying to trust your spouse with that, because sometimes they can't fix that, especially in their own pain.
Right.
But trust God in this moment with what you're walking through, so that you realize there is one walking with you through this.
Right. I like what you just said in this sense, is that when our spouse does try to fix a problem and it's really kind of unsolvable, it's out of their hands, out of their control, what happens is they develop their own emotional wreckage within. They develop chaos within themselves. They have regrets. They think that they're falling short in their marriage. And then what happens is that problem of pain becomes the headline of their marriage. Well, that individual that's trying to help, they need the spouse, even in pain, to listen to them. They need someone to be kind to them and allow them to make mistakes and allow them to express themselves.
Yes. That's
Okay?
beautiful, Gordon.
But what I'd like to say with my valuable takeaway is this. From all of today's lesson, as fun as sexual intimacy might be to talk about, or it can be, it's a very vulnerable topic, and it's not mentioned in a lot of Christian families or discussed on podcasts. I would say that what I've learned through the process, and I'm probably speaking to men more than anyone else in this, is that you're allowed to be completely vulnerable to your spouse. And it's healthy to have a dependency that creates connection. Okay? Not an unhealthy codependency, but a dependency to say, you know what? I do need you because I desire you.
That's so good.
So that want and desire kind of melt together. You know, for us, we've seen that melting together that we wouldn't have had. I think that when we started with the marriage, I said, Cherise, I've got this. Don't even ask. You know, this is not your boundary.
Yeah.
I'm a man. You don't have to
It's like
ask.
a gorilla.
Well, it's not meaning to be that way, but you don't have to go to this space because I want you to be protected.
Right. That's right.
But really, the protection comes from God.
You're right.
So, well, listen. Thank you so much for today's podcast.
This was a good one.
This was a good one. And you can contact us through gordoncherise.com, and you can hit us on YouTube. You can hit the Better Living community. You can watch all our podcasts. You can see the developments of what's happening. Folks, we are growing.
And you can order our book.
You
Pursue
can order
Real Hope.
Very much so.
Yes.
Okay. So we thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll see you next week.
We'll see you next time.